In 1950, Detroit was the fourth largest city in the United States. Nearly 2 million people lived there. Factory workers buying houses, children filling classrooms, families going to church on Sunday mornings and clocking in on Monday at the most productive industrial machine the world had ever seen. The cars rolling off Detroit's assembly lines didn't just move people, they moved America. But today, that same city has fewer than half the people it once had. Entire neighborhoods sit empty. Streetlights that nobody pays to keep on. Schools that closed decades ago and never reopened. 40 square miles of vacant land in a city that used to burst at the seams. Here is the question everyone asks, and nobody fully answers. How does a city that powerful fall that far? And why, after all this time, has it never truly come back? The answer isn't simple, and it didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decisions made over decades by corporations, by politicians, by an entire country that locked Detroit into a fate it has been fighting ever since. This is the story of how America's greatest industrial city was taken apart, piece by piece. To understand the fall, you first have to understand just how extraordinary the rise was. At the turn of the 20th century, Detroit was nothing special, a mid-sized industrial town on the banks of a river. But then Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line, and everything changed. Overnight, Detroit became the center of the automobile universe, and the automobile became the center of American life. The Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of black workers north from the Jim Crow South, drawn by the promise of factory wages. Between 1900 and 1930, the city's population ballooned to 1.5 million people. It kept growing through World War II when Detroit's factories shifted from making cars to making tanks, bombers, and jeeps, earning the city a new name, the Arsenal of Democracy. By 1950, Detroit's population had peaked at nearly 1.8 million. Its workers had the highest wages of any industrial city in America. Black families in Detroit, before things unraveled, had the highest home ownership rate of any black urban population in the entire country. Unemployment in the city sat at just 3.4%. This was a city that worked for everyone. But even as Detroit celebrated its success, something was quietly going wrong beneath the surface, and the people in charge didn't see it, or didn't want to. The most dangerous thing that ever happened to Detroit was its own success. When you are making billions of dollars from one industry, there is no great pressure to build a second one. Detroit had the auto industry. The auto industry had Detroit, and for a while that seemed like enough. But between 1946 and 1956, the Big Three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, built 25 new auto plants in the broader Detroit metropolitan area. Not a single one of them was built inside the city of Detroit itself. Read that again. Not one. The companies were already quietly moving their operations to the suburbs and to lower-cost states. They were beginning to follow the highways that the federal government was building outward from the city center. They were chasing cheaper land, cheaper labor, and eventually cheaper workers overseas. Meanwhile, Detroit had also made another fateful choice about infrastructure. Unlike Chicago or New York, Detroit never built a serious subway or rail network. The city's streetcars were eventually replaced by buses, at the urging, many historians note, of General Motors itself. Without rail transit connecting neighborhoods to jobs, people who couldn't afford a car were trapped. And when the jobs left, they had no way to follow. The trap was set. Detroit just didn't know it yet. The summer of 1967 is when everything came apart at once. 5 days of civil unrest tore through Detroit streets, triggered by a police raid on an unlicensed bar on a July night. By the time it was over, 43 people were dead, almost 1,700 fires had been set, and the United States Army had been called in to restore order. The causes ran deep: decades of racial segregation in housing, discriminatory policing, overcrowded neighborhoods where black families had been systematically blocked from moving into better areas, and mounting frustration with a city that was getting wealthier while leaving much of its population behind. But whatever the causes, the consequences were devastating. White flight, already happening before 1967, became a stampede. In the years before the riots, roughly 22,000 residents a year were leaving the city for the suburbs. In the second half of 1967 alone, that number jumped to 67,000. In 1968, it hit 80,000. Detroit's first black mayor, Coleman Young, later wrote that the riots put Detroit on the fast track to economic desolation. The money, he said, was carried out in the pockets of the businesses and people who fled as fast as they could. Corporate taxes, property taxes, retail dollars, investment. All of it walked out the door. And the people who remained, largely black, largely working class, were left in a city that was hollowing out around them, with a shrinking tax base that could no longer afford to maintain the schools, the streetlights, or the services that might have kept others from leaving too. It was a spiral, and once a city gets caught in one, it is almost impossible to stop. Detroit spent the next 4 decades absorbing one hit after another. In the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo sent gasoline prices through the roof. American drivers, suddenly desperate for fuel efficiency, turned to smaller Japanese cars. Detroit's Big Three, built around big engines and big profit margins, were caught completely flat-footed. Between 1978 and 1982, the American auto industry lost more than 400,000 jobs. Domestic auto production dropped by 46% in just 4 years. The city's population was already falling. Now, even more people left. Through the 1980s and 1990s, competition from foreign automakers combined with economic recessions continued to hollow out the industrial base. City after city around the Midwest watched its factories close. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, St. Louis. But none fell as far as Detroit, because none had bet so completely on a single industry. Then came 2008, the global financial crisis. General Motors and Chrysler both required federal bailouts to survive. Detroit was hit harder than almost any other American city. And in July of 2013, the inevitable arrived. Detroit filed for bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The city had accumulated nearly $18 billion in debt. A third of its residents lived below the poverty line. 30% of its housing units sat vacant. It was, by almost any measure, a city that had failed. But here is where the story gets complicated, because Detroit is not entirely gone, and the question of whether it ever truly recovers depends on something that most headlines don't bother to explain. After emerging from bankruptcy in 2014, the city began slowly, painfully, to rebuild. More than 25,000 abandoned houses were demolished. New apartments and condos rose in downtown and midtown. In the spring of 2024, Detroit hosted the NFL Draft for the first time, and a record-breaking 775,000 people flooded the city over 3 days. The numbers confirmed what was happening on the ground. In 2024, Detroit's population grew for the second year in a row, the first back-to-back population increases the city had seen since the 1950s. The Census Bureau now counts 645,000 residents. Downtown has a new energy. Investment is returning. But step outside the renovated downtown. Walk into the neighborhoods where regular people have lived through all of this. The median household income in Detroit is still just $38,000 a year. 1 in 3 residents still lives in poverty. Unemployment among black Detroiters runs at nearly double the rate for white residents. The recovery that gets celebrated on the evening news is real, but it is concentrated in a small number of blocks near the center of the city. The rest of Detroit is still waiting. And that is the honest answer to the question this video started with. Why has Detroit never recovered? Because recovery, when it finally comes, doesn't always reach the people who suffered most during the fall. It reaches the people with capital first, the developers, the investors, the newcomers who show up once the hard work of survival has already been done by the people who stayed. Detroit's story is not over, and it is not unique. Every city that bets everything on a single industry, that allows racial inequality to fester unchecked, that chooses highways over transit and suburbs over neighborhoods, is building the conditions for its own collapse. Detroit just happened to do all of those things at the same time, on the grandest possible scale. But the people of Detroit, the ones who stayed through the riots, the plant closings, the bankruptcy, the abandoned streets, they never stopped believing the city was worth saving. Coleman Young, that first black mayor, once said that Detroit's losses went a hell of a lot deeper than jobs and buildings. He was right. They went to the heart of what a city promises its people: a fair shot, a decent wage, a neighborhood worth living in. Detroit has never stopped chasing that promise. Whether it gets there depends on whether the recovery spreading outward from downtown ever actually reaches the blocks where that promise was broken. And that is still being decided, right now, in the city that built the American century.